you've got to make this trade-off between sometimes a perfect system will have features A, B, C, and D, but sometimes you don't want to have all of those things because it increases the complexity and it's just going to make it much harder to pass on to the next generation, as there will be some recession, there will be mass layoffs, there might be a portion of your team, if not the whole team, that disappears. And then like, how do you preserve the institutional knowledge becomes messy, and new folks come in, have to inherit all of that. So the simplicity scales slogan really resonates with me as a way of kind of making sure that the systems you build like survive all of the stuff that happens in an organization over time.
Welcome to another edition of Cloud Unfiltered. I'm your host, Michael Chenetz, and this is a special edition at KubeCon Paris.
Yeah, it is.
And my guest here is Sebastian Stadil. Do I pronounce that right?
Yeah,
cool. And Sebastian, why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you're doing?
So I'm Sebastian Stadil. I'm with a co-founder at Scalr. We make tools for people that use Terraform and OpenTofu. And since August of last year, I've been spearheading the OpenTofu initiative along with many others in the community. And I'm here at KubeCon to talk about like infrastructure as code and the world of DevOps and all of that.
Yeah. So you know, I've been a follower of what you've been doing for years, and you know, we were just talking pre-show how, you know, I was looking at Scalr many years ago, and actually we met up many years ago, and you actually remember it.
Yeah.
But you know, it's interesting because when I was looking at that around 2015, 2016, maybe.
Yeah, it's weird to think that's 10 years ago.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
You know, the world was different. It was the world of all the CIOs were saying, we need to go cloud first.
Yeah.
And they really didn't know what that meant, but you know, people were trying to figure it out, and then they were trying to figure out what this thing was, vendor lock-in was, and how to scale out things, and maybe even use, you know, multi-cloud.
Yeah, multi-cloud strategy was all the rage.
It was all the rage back in the day, and you know, there was no like rhyme or reason for any of this. It was just the cool thing to do. But then there was like billing and all these other kinds of things, and the needs were so different back then. I mean, there's still some of those needs are still today, but how do you think it's shifted in terms of where you were when you started and to where it is now?
Yeah. So what's funny about this is because I've been I created my AWS account in like 2006, and that was like for the S3 beta.
There was like four services back then, maybe.
Yeah. No, that was 2006 was pre-EC2. So
okay.
Like EC2 launched in 2007, and like the M1 Small was like the 10 cents an hour machine.
Yep.
And what was interesting is like all of the folks that like started their careers and AWS was new to them. Like now it's been like almost 20 years. So like these folks are now in management. They're in they're some, you know, VPs of organizations. And so as a result of that, you know, now those folks that started with cloud, them being in leadership positions, means that organizations are changing their the way they manage infrastructure. And now it's like software first. It's GitOps, it's infrastructure as code, etc. And so, whereas in the beginning people used the Amazon console, or in the very beginning people asked for there to be a console because there wasn't one. And now we kind of come full circle where it's like code first again.
Yeah, and I think there's been a lot of changes since then too. I mean, before we were talking about using VMs, you know, just putting everything on VMs. And then came Docker and containerization.
Yeah.
And then came, you know, Kubernetes, and then came, you know, all these other things along the way, which actually helped transform that, because we've actually changed the way that we design software now. Now everything is on the network, and they're all microservices communicating. So there's different needs. So it's interesting. I mean, we're talking about it's only been, you know, 15, 20 years maybe, and there's been so much change.
Yeah, back then, Werner was like, and AWS in general was like talking about making VMs ephemeral, making sure that like when they disappeared that they were stateless, and that if they disappeared there wouldn't be an issue. And to some extent that conversation hasn't changed, but like it's the implementation that has changed a million times since.
Yeah. So what's the answer? I mean, obviously today, if you walk around KubeCon, there was a platform engineering day. There was, you know, and it seems to be the big topics, and I'm going to ask you later, so don't let this steer you. But the big topics I've been hearing are platform engineering and AI.
Yep.
And so where where do you think, why do you think it's so big, and where do you think we're going with it?
Yeah, it's kind of funny because like now that it's been like 20 years, there's like we've seen the pendulum swing a couple times between centralization and decentralization, and it never swings fully back to where it used to be, right? And so what tends to happen is like governance becomes decentralized for the sake of speed, but then that becomes a mess over time, and so then there's a push for centralization again. But you still want some of your operations to be decentralized so that your app teams can move faster. And like if you look at 10 years ago, 20 years ago, the way all of that was organized was different. Like you had central IT, and that was like sysadmins, et cetera, and they would just receive the application that was thrown over the fence to them, and that led to DevOps, et cetera. And then you got to a kind of a Netflix or AWS style organizational architecture in which you had application teams that were fully complete, that had their own SRE, they had their own like they could make everything in the stack, and they were autonomous. And the problem is when you have lots of those like that, you end up with huge cost overruns because you don't have good centralized visibility on what teams are spending, et cetera. And that led to the growth of cloud health and all these like building solutions, et cetera, to understand. And then, now we could understand that infrastructure was very expensive and et cetera. We decided to do something about it. And that led to another centralization effort. And so now that centralization effort is called platform engineering, and they're the ones responsible. There's a small, very experienced group of folks that make the governance rules, et cetera, and then they provide autonomy to the teams. And so the pendulum kind of swings back and forth like that.
Do you think that, and I have theories on this, but do you think that because of the COVID and then the VC cuts and then everybody, unfortunately letting a lot of people go in the industry, do you think that there's more of a need for a platform now? Because a lot of people were let go that understood how to use like the raw Kubernetes, understood how to, could just glue and stitch these things together. But now that they let a lot of people go, there's, they don't have all that skill set anymore.
If you remember back in the OpenStack days, this really smart guy, Randy Bias, that you might have crossed his path a few times. He came up with this slogan, which still resonates with me today, which is simplicity scales.
Yeah.
Systems that are simple, are easy to understand, and easy. Like an organization over many, many years will have people come and go, and a lot of institutional knowledge can be lost, et cetera. But complex systems are really, really hard to maintain, not just because they're hard to onboard people, but documentation always sucks, et cetera. And so you've got to make this trade-off between sometimes a perfect system will have features A, B, C, and D, but sometimes you don't want to have all of those things because it increases the complexity, and it's just going to make it much harder to pass on to the next generation, as there will be some recession, there will be mass layoffs, there might be a portion of your team, if not the whole team, that disappears. And then like how do you preserve the institutional knowledge becomes messy, and new folks come in, have to inherit all of that. So the simplicity scales slogan really resonates with me as a way of kind of making sure that the systems you build survive all of the stuff that happens in an organization over time.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that, a lot of people are asking the wrong question too, which is like, how do we scale our cloud native infrastructure? And really, it's, what does your application need? Think about the application needs first, back into the architecture. Yeah. And I think people think too much of a platform first and not really the,
there's so many more considerations than just like how much traffic can we serve, right?
Yeah,
There's dimensions of traffic, of course, but there's the developer experience. There's the survivability of that application with whatever happens in the organization, right? Like remember 2020, like COVID was hitting, everyone was freaking out. All of the boards were all the investors were telling their companies to lay people off, and then that lasted 3 months, and then like freaking hire again, and so like massive change. I think Amazon 5x their headcounts from 2020 to 2022, something like that. And then interest rates rise, and then now we have to like care about, it's just like all of those things happen in a very compressed time period.
Yeah.
And from all the organizations that I work with, there's been like that accordion of like expansion and contraction of staff has really disrupted just ongoing management and maintenance of all these systems that companies have.
Yeah, and really what's important at the end of the day is that they're able to iterate really fast on these products, and that they can develop and in a consistent way. So all of that has to come together along with scale, along with different environments and all these other things that are needed to get it out the door.
Yeah.
So that is a really tough thing to do, and I think it's cool that we have a name now. It's called platform engineering. Because before it was like, okay.
What was it called before?
Maybe it was just DevOps engineer, but there's so many different definitions.
Yeah.
And now we're kind of like honing in on like what this means to be a platform
engineer.
And
so I think I don't know how you define it, but the way I like to think about it is platform engineering is responsible for a very large portion of the developer experience. They're responsible for like the DORA metrics, or just making sure that here's another way of someone working with me put it, like if you were able to measure the ratio that a software engineer spends writing code versus everything else that they do, the higher that ratio is, the better the platform engineering team. But whether it's that metric or DORA metric, etc., they're responsible for improving that, and that means developer experience. That means building the Terraform or Tofu modules that make it easy to deploy stuff.
Yeah, so knowing that the environment has changed a lot, obviously we just chatted about the fact that your solution has changed over time. That it's, even though you confuse people with the name, it's actually a totally different product now, and it's based on OpenTofu, right? And maybe even just start out with like, how did this whole OpenTofu thing come about? I've talked to a few people, by the way, so it's good to hear everybody's like
perspective on it.
Let me see who I talked to: Corey O'Daniel,
to
Ohad,
nice,
M0, to a bunch of other people.
Awesome.
So I know that everybody has their perspective. So I'm curious to see how it came about. And by the way, it's really impressive how fast.
Well, that's thanks to Ohad. That's thanks to Marcin and so many others in the community. So if you backtrack a lot, all the way back to August, all of us in the community are very thankful to Mitchell, very thankful to HashiCorp for like all that they've contributed to the quality of life of us DevOps engineers. I am not privy to the conversations that the HashiCorp board had, and so they, I'm sure they're making the decisions that are right by them, and that they're fine with that. But there's a mountain of projects that have been built on top of Terraform, right? Like almost every CNCF project uses or used to use Terraform in the build process, and so. Having such a vital piece of the infrastructure for building all these projects suddenly no longer be open source was problematic. So it was very easy to rally the community around making a fork happen. And then something magical happened, which is not only were we able to gather people that just wanted to make the fork happen, but it turns out that since 2015, there's a lot of people that wanted Terraform to improve much faster than it was being improved. For example, because there's all these conflicts, right, between what goes in Terraform open source and what goes in Terraform Cloud, because HashiCorp has to sell a product, right?
Sure.
And so that was creating all these tensions between what went here and what went there, and so the governance or the decision making of what went into Terraform was very tightly controlled by HashiCorp. So something magical happened, which is all of these folks that were frustrated that their PRs, that their ideas and and the issues that they created with Terraform had never been addressed, they all en masse moved to the Tofu community. And so I think in an informal survey, and take every survey with a grain of salt, none of them is scientific, but they give some sort of indication. About 30% or 1 in 3 of the respondents on that Twitter survey said that they were either today using OpenTofu or were planning to in the very near future. So that means we've gone from 0 to 30% since August. That's in 6 months. It's incredible. And so I think it's not just a fork, right? It's not just like, hey, we're keeping the project open source. It's now we have an open governance model. We have a community-driven model where we're taking the best ideas from anybody and making a true meritocracy out of that. A great example is the work that was done with the OpenTofu registry, where we had a number of designs that we discussed internally. And then when we opened it up for community suggestions, the stuff we got was so much better. And there's a presentation by James and Errol on that yesterday at OpenTofu Day. And they did a fantastic job of explaining how we got something out for simplicity, like just something out the door really quick that didn't really scale well. And then we went through the process of building a stable registry, and that's how we collected all the ideas for how to build it. And that talk I recommend anybody listening here to go listen to that talk. Is a great example of what happens when you get motivated, experienced people from all around the world pitching in ideas, and that leading to an architecture that doesn't cost us $1 to run, creates zero issues for anybody, scales incredibly well, and just an overall superior solution.
And from what I hear, the actual OpenTofu has features now that surpass some of the features.
Yeah. I mean, I love this stuff, right?
Yeah.
So one such example in 1.7, client-side state encryption is being released. There's some other good stuff there, but that's like the flagship feature. And the release model for OpenTofu is like we'll choose one flagship feature for every release. And when that flagship feature is ready, boom, the release comes out. And so that'll be 1.7, 1.8, etc. And so that's the current model for releasing. And so the flagship feature for 1.7 is client-side state encryption. And so a lot of financial institutions, a lot of enterprises, a lot of three-letter government agencies are really interested in that, because that means you can encrypt stuff, and doesn't matter where you end up putting your state file is in whatever vendor you have managing that, whether it's Amazon via S3 or others. You've encrypted it client-side, and you're just giving them an encrypted. You can encrypt it a second time if you want to, but that means that you have end-to-end encryption of your secrets, of all of the state you have, and so that's super powerful. And then if you're using a backend like Scalr or like any other, that means that you don't have to trust those vendors. You can just encrypt it yourself, and they don't get exposed to it. And that's something that never got into Terraform. And I think the first time it was the pull request to add an implementation of it was in 2016, so it's been a while. And the reason never got into Terraform is because that diminishes the added value of their commercial offering, Terraform Cloud. And so now that OpenTofu doesn't have those perverse incentives, and so it makes it into the product, into the project. And so that direction, it's just very liberating to have there's no bad incentives, or there's no kind of tension around commercial products. And so that's just really exciting to see. And as a result of that, we're getting a lot more people that are submitting issues, requesting things, etc. And so the momentum is growing.
That's amazing. I mean, it's amazing to see. I always find it amazing to see what a community does with something once they're allowed to do something with it, and they come together to do something, because a lot of times the stuff you don't even think about, it's like you said, you had an idea for a registry, but then you gave it out to the community
and get so much better architectures for it. Yeah.
So it's that excites me about that, just to see what people come up with.
It's also super demotivating, right? Like if you have a great idea and you spend a lot of time writing it up and you submit it to an open source project, or like a project, or like let's say in the case here Terraform, and that stays open. I think we had a talk yesterday about this. Like the oldest still open issue on the Terraform repo is like 9 years old, something like that. So it's demotivating to make contributions to a project and then have those contributions either be ignored or be closed with no follow-up, etc. And so the maintainers that we have on the OpenTofu project are amazing people. They're spending lots of time with the community, making sure all of the issues are discussed, making sure we have a transparent decision-making process, And that's what it takes to make a healthy open source project.
So what if somebody down the road wants to make a commercial version of OpenTofu?
They're more than welcome to do that. You can fork OpenTofu and make it. If you've got some ideas of where to take the project, and you're free to make a fork of it. It's still MPL licensed, and you can make your own value add on top of that.
Sure.
And that's something you can't do with Terraform anymore, sadly. But as a true open source project, that's possible, and we welcome anybody to improve it, or to make a fork and serve the community by making something better. But the core is always open source, and the Linux Foundation makes very sure of that.
Yeah, and what about obviously we always see cloud providers taking on these open source projects and then commercializing them. Do you foresee something like OpenTofu in AWS or I'm not asking for inside information. I'm just saying, could you foresee something like that?
So I actually have a few thoughts over there on that topic that I think are worth discussing. One, all the major cloud providers. They don't love being disintermediated, right? And if you think about Amazon, which obsesses around the customer, they don't love that the experience that their customers have with their products is limited by the quality of Terraform, right? They can make contributions and improvements to the provider, to the AWS provider, but they don't control Terraform itself, sure. And so it becomes a limiting factor. Same thing for Microsoft, same thing for Google, same thing for Oracle Cloud.
They want that full experience. Yeah.
And so now OpenTofu provides an opportunity to them to improve the experience that their customers have with their products, because it's an openly governed project. And if they have something that they want to suggest, and for example, Oracle has made contributions to make it easier for their customers to use OpenTofu to store state on their cloud. And so we're seeing that. And I think it's obviously I'm not privy to all the conversations happening there, but I can imagine that they would be excited for that they have this path to no longer be disintermediated, as almost everyone uses Terraform, almost everyone uses infrastructure as code, and so this is a welcome thing. I think we're gonna wink wink, we're gonna see some cool stuff coming in the next 6 to 12 months coming from them.
So going back to, obviously you have a leg in the race here with OpenTofu. What have you built, with the evolution of Scalr to take advantage of OpenTofu? What is this new kind of thing?
So if you think about the problems, there's when you're using OpenTofu, it's not, or Terraform for that sake, because they're very related. When you start adopting it at scale, you run into problems of collaboration, problems around automation. You might want to just have access control. You might want to have SSO integrate with Okta, etc. And so, as an organization grows in their adoption of Tofu, they very naturally start looking for tools. One such tool is Atlantis, very popular for using for posting the results of your plan into a GitHub comments or any VCS. And so it's an example of kind of, as an organization grows, you want to start capturing information, collaborating better. And then organizations eventually outgrow Atlantis, and then they move to what's called a TACO, a Tofu automation collaboration software. Scalr is one of those. There are many others. And so in the Tofu community, you just have a lot of a very rich ecosystem of tools that build value on top. Scalr is one that is focused on organizations that are making big investments in Terraform and Tofu, but limited to that. So we don't support CloudFormation, we don't support Pulumi or any of those. We're laser focused on the experience you have with Terraform and with OpenTofu. And if you subscribe to that, if you as an organization are making a decision that you're going to that you're going to centralize your organization or standardize your organization on those technologies, then we are best in class for serving that particular market. And so that's the kind of the value we have for organizations that are scaling, organizations that are growing on those.
I'm curious, a lot of people are still doing things like Terraform, but there have been a lot of changes. Like if you think about Kubernetes right now, everybody wants Kubernetes as their control plane. It's a control plane. Obviously there's things like cross-plane, that can take that, and if you believe Kubernetes should be the control plane, you can make that the control plane for everything. Yeah. So why do you think people haven't, or in scale haven't moved to that kind of framework versus something like...
Yeah, excellent question. So I do think there's a very large portion of so if you think about your organization as a myriad or plethora of services, I think eventually you'll have 50 to 60% of those services running in some Kubernetes cluster or another, whatever the time horizon is. But there are so many very useful SaaS pieces of software out there, whether it's Snowflake or whether it's I don't know, there's just so many Lambda, whatever. You're going to want to manage all of those, and Tofu is a great way to manage those as code. And so if you want to make a change to how you configure your S3 buckets, use Tofu for that. You're not going to use Kubernetes to manage your S3. So as you look at, it's not just compute, networking, and storage. There's like all of these database services, all of these caching services, DNS services. There's just so much that constitutes an application that we're going to see Tofu be a very large portion of all of that. And then you'll still have your containers running on Kubernetes, and they don't compete. It's just one is for managing the configuration services, and the other one's runtime for managing all your containers and those services.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. So what do you think? What's next? What's next for everybody in this industry, or what's next for you?
Yeah, great question. So I'm right now really excited about the future of Tofu and kind of the direction there. I do think that over the next, say, 5 to 10 years, we're not gonna see a major change in kind of that pattern. But what we are going to see is organizations that are using Tofu to manage the configuration of many additional systems. And so, for example, there's like a Salesforce provider, right? So you don't necessarily need to log into Salesforce anymore to change your admin rights and the configuration of stuff. And being able to use a Tofu provider for managing your Salesforce configuration means that you get all of the advantages of you want to make a change. You can have somebody else review the change that you wanted to make. You can then deploy that, and you've got a log of who made what change, who reviewed it, when it happened, versus somebody goes in as an admin to Salesforce and makes some configuration change, and then you have to figure out the audit log there. And so I think what's going to happen is the footprint of Tofu in an organization is just going to increase to not just cloud infrastructure, but like all the configuration of all of the systems that an organization has.
So what happened to like the Ansibles and the Chefs and all those other, configuration management systems?
Still very useful for managing what's inside of a VM. Still not very good for managing what's outside of a VM. I think they've all tried really hard to break out of that. But I think Mitchell's genius here was figuring out the right level of abstraction for managing resources, right? If you think about it, there's like Apache libcloud, which is a kind
I love libcloud.
Yeah, but it's a great way to manage VMs and other services across clouds, but it's a lowest common denominator approach. And sometimes you need those, the thing that one cloud has and another cloud doesn't. And so now you've got these proprietary extensions. And so now what's the point of using a library that abstracts away differences if you're re-implementing the differences on top? So you got this leaky abstraction. But I think Mitchell was incredibly clever to come up with like deciding that it was going to be a DSL, and there's a lot to talk about whether DSL versus language, but then also deciding abstract away authentication, to abstract away syntax, to abstract away all these things, but not to abstract away the like all the parameters that go into deciding, is it going to be this kind of VM on Amazon, or is it going to be this kind of VM on Google? Because you actually do care about those things being different. And so figuring out the right abstraction is what he got right, and that's obviously vindicated by the adoption.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I'm doing this new thing on my show where I'm trying to figure out if a term is buzzworthy or buzzworthless.
Okay, let's do that.
So I'm going to start with old school, which is DevOps.
Okay.
Is that buzzworthy or buzzworthless?
I started out buzzworthy. It's definitely. I think we've gotten to the point now where it's like you're never certain enough of what it means, even within people in an organization, that it creates more. What do you mean by that? And the conversation, the rat holes you get into that way, than not. So yeah, that's my take on it.
So now it's buzzworthless. It's kind of
totally.
over
And
time.
then on top of that, and on top of that, there's some things that should remain off, some things that should remain dev. Like you don't want all of your software engineers to also be cloud experts, and so there's some level there that's different. And now we're getting into the rat hole of what's DevOps.
Yeah.
so
kind of the inverse, or maybe newer term, platform engineering. Buzzworthy or buzzworthless?
I think it's a very useful way of grouping together all of the people whose job is to make the developer experience better, making it easier for them to iterate. And I think it's just a better defined term, and a better way of describing these separation of responsibilities. Now, there's still organizations where there's both a platform team and then there might be also a security team that's like adjacent to it, or sometimes it's inside. So it's like still not perfect, but it's definitely an improvement.
Yeah. So one last question. We're here at KubeCon. What excites you? When you walk around here, is there any new technology or anything that interests you that you see or?
So I'm again, it's just incredibly, like, I'm walking around with this this Terraform Tofu apply t-shirts, and I'm just so energized by being just walking around the show floor or in conferences, and people just stopping me and kind of asking me if I'm related in some way to the OpenTofu project, and being able to strike a conversation. Yeah. And the level of passion is just awesome. It's so energizing. And so this is the reason why open source communities almost always win. We saw this with Jenkins and Hudson, I think it was the other project was called. We see this over and over again, where like open source communities are just very passionate, and passion ends up winning over the long run.
Yeah, definitely. So if you could sum up what you think the trend is for this KubeCon, what do you think? Oh,
I have not walked around all enough of the talks, etc. There's a lot of AI stuff.
Obviously.
I'm interested in those products as a consumer. I've never really dug into like how an LLM is actually made.
Yep.
And so I'm kind of intellectually curious about all of that. But it's like what, 1 out of 2 booths out on the show floor is like some AI something.
Yeah.
Among all of them, some of them will be the next Googles, and most of them will be forgotten.
Yeah.
And but I don't know if you've used ChatGPT or any of those services, but they're magical.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah,
of course.
Like Gemini is also really good, but for like very factual things. I think that compared to like, there's been so many.
I use I think it's Perplexity AI or something.
I've heard about that. What you like about it?
Yeah, so what's nice about that is that it actually takes all of the AI engines, figures out what you need, and then will use the right engine for it. But it's actually a search engine too. So you could actually say like, on this page, summarize or do something like that. And there's plugins and stuff like that. So it's really powerful on how it works, and it's ChatGPT.
Sold.
So definitely check that one out.
Okay.
It's definitely one of the more interesting ones that I think out there. But it's still so early. I'm so excited to see what comes next.
Yeah. I had heard about Perplexity a few times and never bothered to try it out. But I'm sold on checking it out now.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. This has been amazing.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Take care, Michael.